folks at BCN, other W, for hosting me and for making this so smooth. And thank you, Keith, for years of friendship and comradeship. I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you and excited about this topic. So I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and what I'm planning to, that should be plenty of time for our discussion. And what I want to do this afternoon is offer an exploration of the role of expressive culture and what I'm calling queer feminist aesthetics in adjudicating the dystopian here and now. In so doing, I'm hoping to illuminate the broader ways that my work tries to engage not only race radical queer feminist post-colonial study and the critical life worlds that it makes possible, but how this work contributes to a range of interdisciplinary projects that centrally impact my work, and I know the work of many of you in this room as well. So my argument today is going to be that a turn to what I'm calling queer visionary aesthetics from the frontiers of US empire, including sites like occupied Palestine, which is the subject of my talk, can help redirect our attention to the affects, sensations, and imaginative practices of indigenous and racially or politically dispossessed peoples, practices that both underscore and move us beyond the power of imperial and settler security state control. This is especially relevant always, but today I just turned on my phone as I was waiting with Keith this morning and noticed that the Trump administration decided to no longer consider West Bank settlements illegal. So when we talk about the forever war, it is always the dystopian here and now. And part of my work in thinking about cultural production is how to imagine otherwise in the context of that kind of aggression and brutality. So, as I was saying here, we need these critical alternative knowledges now more than ever in the face of multiple overlapping political crises. In foregrounding the alternative realm of the aesthetic in my critique of empires past and present, I'm not suggesting that we abandon our critique of the dystopian here and now, but instead prioritize creative spaces of pleasure, joy, desire, fugitivity, renewal, as well as oldies but goodies like hope, healing, and survival in calamitous times. My focus on visionary aesthetics is aimed at identifying and animating radical experiments with insurgent consciousness, with speculative, fabulous, and otherworld imaginings that defy the borders and orders of settler security states. So my presentation today represents a kernel of the broader study that I just published, as Keith mentioned, Insurgent Aesthetics, Security, and the Queer Life of the Forever War. And this book engages a wide range of critical paradigms in our fields to reveal the radical experiments, aesthetic strategies, and freedom dreams of contemporary diasporic artists from South Asia and the greater Middle East. Together, these works comprise a transnational constellation of visual art and aesthetics that conjure new ways to think, feel, sense, and map the world amidst US security state violence and its forever wars of the post-9/11 era. Specifically, the book examines the broader post-Cold War expansion of US militarism in the greater Middle East, with a focus on Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Palestine, as well as the domestic regimes of surveillance and repression in the US and other militarized sites mapped onto a transnational jihadist network. I do so through a contrapuntal queer feminist analysis of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic cultural forms and their critical intersections with the logics and tactics of US global warfare. While many scholars have studied the impact of liberal empires and late modern war, little attention has been paid to how the state's dominant necropolitical calculus of security is being challenged and reimagined by artists and cultural producers drawn from the very populations and their diasporic kin targeted for US global warfare in the region through their artwork. So my book shifts the transnational study of war and empire to illuminate what I'm calling insurgent aesthetics, an alternative articulation of minoritarian knowledge produced by those most devastated by the effects of global warfare. Today's talk joins this broader effort in particular by extending my analytic concern for US neoliberal and racial regimes of security to the US government's entanglement with Israeli state violence and the ongoing territorial colonization and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I'm going to make this relational move here by attending to the critical and social potential of works by London-based Palestinian artist Larissa Sansour. And Sansour is the artist I'm going to be talking about today. Her transnational multimedia art practice spans video, photography, experimental documentary, graphic novels, and new media. And I want to think alongside two of her short science fiction films to advance the scholarly conversation on visionary aesthetics and the borders of empire, as well as to provide an account of political imaginings of Palestine beyond what I'm calling the dystopian here and now, bringing together insights on the territorial, affective, and ethical dimensions of the Palestinian struggle with anti-colonial and race-radical queer feminist utopian criticism. I'm going to question what outer space flight and science fiction fantasy in particular might yield for thinking the visionary pasts, presents, and futures of Palestine and Israel. Sound good? Okay. So my analysis of Sansour's work in the context of US-Israeli settler security state violence and warfare is productively enabled by what cultural historian Keith P. Feldman has called Palestine's breach in US knowledge production. That is the growing, if belated, constellation of intellectual and political interventions made by scholars of transnational American studies, Middle Eastern studies, Asian American studies, anthropology, queer and feminist studies, and native and indigenous studies, who have forged an ethical and political relation to Palestine in their work. And I imagine that's many people in this room as well who are interested in these questions. So collectively, these scholars have forged an ethical and political relation to Palestine, as I said, and have sharpened new directions in the field by situating Palestine and Palestinian solidarity at the heart of a critical American studies project. I aim to contribute to this collective endeavor here, and in the process illustrate how queer feminist, Arab futurist, speculative imaginaries of Palestinian liberation can forward the vital form of insurgent aesthetics that I trace throughout my book. So I'm going to add that as a non-Arab queer feminist scholar of color, my analysis is essentially informed by the already vibrant and heterogeneous diasporic discourse on Palestine post-return futures led by diverse groups of Palestinians themselves. To be in political solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, I think, means using opportunities like this one to amplify Palestinian voices and a diversity of thought and practice on conversations on Palestinian solidarity. And let's have more discussions about that in our Q&A. So as part of my analysis of visionary aesthetics in the post-Oslo period, I harnessed the critical frameworks of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and indigenous futurisms. These concepts are especially apt here, given the US's special relationship and so-called shared values with the State of Israel, an alliance that took different shape after 9/11, but has been expressed consistently through unprecedented and unassailable geostrategic, military, and economic support for the State of Israel for more than 6 decades. I thus joined scholars seeking to capture the expanse of Israel's ongoing theft of land and resources from Palestinians, its coordinated system of apartheid, its siege on Gaza, the fences and walls it continues to build in the West Bank to annex land and restrict movement, its ongoing support of illegal settlements, and related daily atrocities in Palestine. In the context of Palestine and Israel, Zionism operates as a form of settler colonial violence, primarily through the logic of native, indigenous, Palestinian Arab erasure. This critical move, analyzing Zionism as a settler colonial project of racial capitalism, undermining Palestinian rights to property, inhabitants, and movement, is part of a broader reorientation of scholarship and activism away from a narrow focus on the occupied territories toward a more comprehensive focus on Israeli practices toward Palestinians inside Israel, in the occupied territories, and in the diaspora. And of course, Keith and other people are very much part of that conversation. Israel is a leading domain for the manufacture of militarized settler security technologies, including especially its vertical and atmospheric weapons of warfare in the neoliberal presence. This process is facilitated and financed principally by the United States through its geostrategic alliances and forever wars of security and terror in the Greater Middle East. Later, I'm going to return to the abundant scholarship detailing these joint strategic collaborations between military and security planners in the US and Israel, as well as the lateral circuits of securitization and violence across incommensurable geographies that characterize the post-Cold War military consensus. But my primary goal here, as promised, as in my book, is to turn away from these dominant imbricated structures of state security, to focus instead on the affective structures and aesthetic forms of resistance found in Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic culture, activism, and scholarship. An explicit turn toward an analysis of Larissa Sansour's Insurgent Aesthetics in the face of US-funded Israeli settler colonialism better allows us to formulate speculative alternatives to Zionist frontier relations, both in Palestine and Israel and across the diaspora, with Palestine serving as the foremost conduit and inspiration for divining those once unimaginable visionary futures. So Sansour's science fiction film trilogy provides a crucial point of departure for conjuring those seemingly impossible futures for Palestine alongside, after, and beyond the imperial violence of US and Israeli settler security states. In her 2012 art film and digital photo series titled Nation Estate, we glean an unlikely aperture into the present-day Israeli occupation, settlements, and related miseries produced by the state of forever war. This piece is comprised of a glossy 9-minute high-definition CGI film and digital outtake photo series, and I'm going to focus primarily on the photos rather than show you the film. So utilizing tropes of science fiction and pop culture, Sansour humorously dreams up a near-future world where the Palestinian people, left with nowhere to build but up, have constructed their own state in a single skyscraper, the nation of states. One colossal high-rise houses the entire Palestinian population, now finally living the high life. Each city has its own floor. Jerusalem on the 13th floor, Ramallah on the 14th, Sansour's native Bethlehem on the 21st, and so on. Inter-city trips, previously marked by checkpoints, are now made simply by elevator. So as the short film opens, we see our heroine, a new arrivant to the nation state, clad in Battlestar Galactica couture, ascending a large escalator with a carry-on luggage in tow. And a serene voice announcer on the loudspeaker instructs new visitors, first in Arabic and then in English, to please prepare for security checkpoints. The camera then zooms into close-ups of Sansour's fingerprint and iris being scanned for biometric identification. And this shot, as well as the advertisements in the elevators reminding passengers to ensure that their passports are valid and up to date, provide stark reminders that prophylactic and punitive tactics of Israeli surveillance and security do not simply disappear, even in this seemingly high-tech, dystopic, decolonizing near-future Palestinian society. We see shots of our pregnant female protagonist, and there she is in the lobby, this gorgeous palatial lobby. Right? Here she is waiting, walking solemnly with purpose through the pristine, palatial, but mostly deserted lobby of the nation estates. The skyscraper itself is a monumental, if soulless, marble structure surrounded by concrete walls on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And as the film proceeds, we hear sounds of Sansour's heavy breathing with another extreme close-up shot of depicting her blinking eye as her condensed breath fogs an invisible glass enclosure. It's cold or overly air-conditioned in the nation estate, so we wonder if she's reconsidered her arrival, and we know that breath is constitutive to flight and to the aesthetics of otherwise possibility. More on that in a second. Next, the camera pans up to a massive Palestinian flag adorning the wall. Under the sounds of drum beats, this is this image. We see dramatic reference to the iconic 1930s Zionist political propaganda poster, usually titled Visit Palestine, with its lush depiction of pastoral pre-war Jerusalem, except these posters have been reimagined, ironically, instead as Vision Nation Estate, with images of Israel's still standing apartheid wall in the distance. Finally, the short clip ends with our heroine entering a lift to make her aspirational ascent up the nation state. Okay, so this hyper-capitalist high-rise building that Sansour imagines stands in steep contrast, of course, to the actual built environment of present-day Palestinian cities, which are generally low-rise and sprawling, even as their Arab indigenous inhabitants have become increasingly compelled to build vertically, especially in refugee camps, where horizontal expansion is undermined by the stranglehold of Israeli settlements. Here I want to suggest that geographical specificity that demands verticality from Palestinians under occupation also functions as a mode of material resistance in ways that point to new aesthetic strategies, building on the tradition of speculative resistance on which Arab futurism as a formation draws. The aesthetics of Sansour's luxury skyscraper likewise diverge from the high-density, low-income public housing tower blocks or council estates across Western Europe that must also serve as a significant reference for our London-based artists. These high-rise flats were created in utopian aspiration for post-war socialist-influenced governments in Europe, but now function largely as warehouses for the poor and recent immigrants and refugees. The tower block images of the council estate have reappeared in the collective Western architectural imagination after the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, when a 24-story block of public housing flats in northern London went up in flames, causing over 80 deaths and 70 injuries. That post-fire public outcry precipitated a formal government inquiry and brought renewed attention to the lack of safety precautions used by greedy residential housing developers, endemic patterns of housing segregation, and the enduring racial and economic precarities of those predominantly Arab, Muslim, and North African immigrants living in council estates in urban centers across Europe. So the accompanying outtake series of 7 photographs that I promised depicts key scenes on floors of the nation state. So each floor housed distinct Palestinian cities, and you can see the list here, right? Dead Sea, energy and sanitation, vertical urban planning, aid and development. While the skyscraper itself is surrounded by concrete walls, its inhabitants would be able to move effortlessly from one Palestinian city to another using elevators, and to travel in and out of their country using a high-tech subway system, a stark contrast to the manifold constraints on space and mobility that everyday Palestinians presently endure. For example, in one of the photographs, we see our heroine exploring the Jerusalem, here it is, cruising past A replica of the renowned Dome of the Rock Mosque as she entered powders a pair of weary-eyed local residents of the nation-state. Like, who's this new girl, right? We see ads for Gaza Shore, the best sushi on the block, and other iconic squares and landmarks of lost cities relocated to the lobbies of each floor of the skyscraper, with residential living quarters presumably tucked away nearby. The photographs are laden with heavy Palestinian and Arab symbolism, olive trees, keffiyehs, flags, and over-the-top cliches that self-consciously depict a sterile, clinical, and cold sovereign future for Palestine. In another photograph, for instance, our lone heroine is seen nestled in her own room, performing gendered domestic chores that would seem to be crucial to future planetary survival, like watering an olive tree, that iconic natural symbol for Palestinian resistance, resilience, and connection to the land. However, in this surreal setting that foregrounds in ecological ethics as part of her queer feminist dystopian vision of Palestinian survival, the tree's roots are inexplicably growing out from her apartment floor. In another image that explores the divide between the organic and inorganic, here we have our protagonist seated alone at a large rectangular dining table, contemplatively eating a salad while surrounded by dirty porcelain dishes and bowls littered in her otherwise spotless room. This image draws attention to an imagined endgame of separate capitalism. It further advances tropes of waste, excessive consumption, and unsustainable farming practices that disconnect the skyscraper's residents and their self-contained artificial ecosystem from the natural indigenous landscape of Palestine. An even more fantastical photograph here shows Sansour casually strolling along the beachfront of the Mediterranean seafloor. A large boat is pulled up alongside the beach shore, waves crashing at her feet, with what appears to be an Israeli helicopter hovering atop the glass ceiling enclosure, surveilling the scene from above. Finally, and perhaps the most haunting of all the photographs in the series, a nighttime scene depicts Sansour peering out from her apartment's gunshot-stricken glass windows in the nation-state. A reflection of the actual still gleaming city of Jerusalem just over the Israeli apartheid wall surfaces on the window while the foreground illumines the lamp of an Israeli watchtower casting a long shadow across the apartheid wall. It's as if our solitary artist protagonist is being held against her will, a reluctant witness to the vestiges of Israel's wartime violence persisting outside all around her. Above all, this final scene crafts a haunting, ambivalent future for Palestinians living the high life. Sansour's startling, if still glossy, images of nation-state are meant to shock the viewer into recalling that even in this fantasy of a luxury high-rise coast oasis home where Palestinians finally have their own nation-state, the brutal realities of Israeli settlers' colonial occupation and war are not entirely over and gone. Instead, Sansour's speculative visual dystopia provides a mode of visionary fiction that forces her viewers to wrestle with the ongoing questions of Palestinian dispossession, state recognition, and unfreedom anew. Now, by visionary fiction, I'm seeking to build on and advance the conceptual work of Walida and Marisha and Adrienne Marie Brown, editors of Octavia's Brood, science fiction stories for social justice movements. These writers argue that radical science fiction is actually better termed visionary fiction, because it pulls from real-life experience, inequalities, and movement building to create innovative ways of understanding the world around us, paint visions of new worlds that could be, and teach us new ways of interacting with one another. Visionary fiction engages our imaginations and hearts and guides our hands as organizers. So I want to build on this framework here to capture the broader literary, visual, performance, and expressive culturals aligned with social justice movements that at once critique differential distributions of power, resources, and life chances in the present, while also conjuring what German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch once called the anticipatory illumination of art, necessary to envisage social life anew. Visionary fiction thus offers a powerful framework through which to understand the aesthetic and political projects of Palestinian diasporic artists as part of a broader global and transnational freedom struggle. Indeed, the prefigurative impulse behind visionary fiction and its dreams for revitalizing radical social movements and social worlds resonates deeply with the critical queer of color and queer diasporic utopian project that I seek to amplify in my book, and that now guides my treatment of Sansour's visual form. Indeed, a certain kernel of utopian political possibility animating queer studies has been a formative site for my critique and elaboration of visionary fiction and speculative world-making in Arab and South Asian diasporic public cultures. In the words of the late great theorist of futurity, Jose Esteban Munoz, queerness is, quote, that thing that lets us feel that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing. We can glimpse the worlds proposed and promised by queerness in the realm of the aesthetic, he says. Central to identifying these new futures is a focus on speculative archives, those blueprints of what Anspeckovich called the insurgent and experimental genres of queer cultures that attempt to make things, to be creative, to do something. As Munoz elaborates, queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on the potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. So building on concepts by Bloch, Barth, and Jameson, Munoz identified the utopian as relational to historically situated struggles, a quotidian impulse traceable in minoritarian life. This impulse is to be glimpsed as something that is extra to the everyday transaction of heteronormative capitalism. This quotidian example of the utopian can be glimpsed in utopian bonds, affiliations, designs, and gestures that exist within the present moment. So, I want to employ Munoz's foundational insights on the world-making and socially transformative power of queer color speculation here, not only to refine my reading of Sansour's work, but also to argue that visionary aesthetics provides a compelling perceptual regime through which to search for those elusive facts on the ground of US and Israeli securitization. My point is that concrete utopias are imminent to and emerge in relation to historical conditions of inequity that they seek to eradicate. I'm following sociologist Avery Gordon's insight here that if we define a utopia not as it's commonly defined, as a homogeneous, perfect future no place, but rather as a standpoint for living in the here and now, then we might find meaningful instances of it in the history of social struggle. So I'm belaboring these connections between queer feminist inquiry and the anti-colonial, decolonial, and race-radical facets of my analysis of future imaginings of Palestine in works by Sansour, not only because queer feminist criticism best theorizes concrete forms of utopia and pleasure for differentially racialized and colonized subjects in the context of enduring settler colonial violence, but also because it's only through these interpretive frameworks, as I'm showing here, that we can draw out a more robust account of her interventions into an already vibrant array of visionary cultural works imagining the future of Palestine post-return. So her contributions in Nation State here, Larissa's, offer a critical mode of reflection, expressing an anticipatory consciousness that is not simply an uncritical escape into the realm of fantasy, but instead a renewed point of departure for diagnosing the material circumstances, those facts on the ground of Palestine-Israel, as well as dreaming concrete utopias anew. As anthropologist Julie Petit has observed on the present-day settler colonial condition in the occupied territories, but Palestinians often narrate their experiences of closure and related subjection as living in an open-air prison. This post-Oslo policy of closure refers to Israeli restrictions on the movement of Palestinian goods, labor, and people into Jerusalem, in and between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and between them and Israel. For Palestinians, closure and separation have resulted in fragmentation, economic devastation, social fracturing, and a deep sense of isolation and abandonment. So given the necropolitical impact of these toxic carceral protocols of post-Oslo neoliberal governance on the lives of Palestinians, it's intriguing that Sansour appears to knowingly conjure a dystopian near-future closed-air prison skyscraper as the visionary fictive opposite of the present-built environment for Palestinians living under Israeli settler colonial rule. The dream for better living that she conjures is neither an off-world escape or displaced fetish, and yet the vertical politics of enclosure and occupation are quite literally reimagined. So her aesthetics allow me to highlight further the role of architecture, geography, and material infrastructures as potent sites of both violent settler colonial subjugation, as I've discussed, and anti-colonial resistance in vertical terms. To rethink the geometry of occupation and settler security state violence in this way immediately conjures the influential work of Israeli architect and theorist Eyal Weizman, whose insights into the politics of verticality have offered a critical language to analyze the architectural dimensions of the ongoing Israeli occupation of shrinking Palestinian lands, water, sewage, and airspace. In Weizman's estimation, the post-Oslo moment has featured new forms of bio and macro-political governmentality in the West Bank to assemble a large three-dimensional volume, layered with strategic, religious, and political stratum. He describes the formation of three layers of control: the hills and valleys, groundwater and sewage, and finally airspace over the West Bank, to illustrate how the same topography is traversed in radically separate layers, a top one allocated for Israelis and a bottom one to Palestinians. Critics of Israeli settler colonialism, it follows, must attend to both the vertical and subterranean topography, as Israel maintains control of both the skies and the underworld, without ever either appearing on political or military maps. Right? So this question of verticality is so captured by the dominant settler imagination. The critical constellations of ideas, policies, projects, and regulations proposed by Israeli state technocrats generals, archaeologists, planners, and road engineers since the occupation of the West Bank together comprises what Weisman calls the politics of verticality, this dominant epistemology for territorial enclosure and disjuncture that remains a crucial settler colonial tactic in the here and now occupation. But the dystopian genre that Sansour advances in her work provides a fruitful lens, I think, to capture the affective contours of visibly and socially shrinking space amidst the interminable Zionist siege on land, democracy, and political resources. Unlike Weisman's diagnosis of the dominant orders of settler security state violence in post-Oslo Palestine, Sansour proposes a radically slantwise approach to these concerns in her art practice, a mix of critical escapology and concrete utopian thinking that not only allows us to imagine otherwise, but to imagine up. Sansour's aesthetic choice of the skyscraper is particularly telling given its pivotal role in structuring social and aesthetic perception across the long 20th century. Whereas so much of contemporary settler colonial visualities conjure these flat images of Palestinian refugee camps and Israeli settlements dotting the hills and valleys of Palestine, the gargantuan skyscraper, that glossy emblem of modernity and progress, is a powerful instrument of perception that's transformed Western modernity's modes of seeing. The first tall, fireproof metal buildings were erected in the West in the late 19th century, the apex of the imperial era, and they quickly became touted as a paramount index of the alliance of thrusting capital and adventurous technology that characterized the driving force of modernity. These large buildings eradicated large portions of earlier built environments and communities, and often required a significant reshaping of the terrain below. This social reorganization echoes what media scholar Lisa Parks, writing on the contemporary use of drones, succinctly terms vertical mediation, the potential to materially alter or affect the phenomena of the air, spectrum, and ground through the vertical fields, and expanse that Parks sees as extending from the Earth's surface, including the geological layers below, and built environments above through the domains of the spectrum and the air and the outer limit of the orbit. Skyscrapers also vertically mediate airspace, built environment, ground, historical memories, and ways of being buried beneath and around them. The skyscraper thus always signifies a cemetery, built on the dead ends and detours of histories and futures past. Such affective and aesthetic politics also surround the skyscraper and nation state. Sansour's use of the form to move Palestinians in and up gives us another perceptual regime through which to reimagine the politics of verticality and vertical mediation, even as we hold on to the vulnerability and fragility of vertical living that she depicts. It's also, of course, offering a tongue-in-cheek response to the Gulfian obsession with erecting these skyscrapers to conjure a sense of national greatness in tall buildings that now dot the skyline of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. In short, Sansour's nation-state reads architecture and technology as viable but vexed tools for decolonization and the front project of sovereignty that is possessed. So nation-state draws on an earlier work by the artist titled A Space Exodus, which is the second and final piece I want to discuss today. Are you guys doing okay? People need to go, things happening, distraction, everyone breathe. So this is the second piece I want to talk about in closing. So here, Sansour adapts Stanley Kubrick's 1968 science fiction film, A Space Odyssey, for the Palestinian-Israeli context. The music scores of the original film are being reimagined here with the cadences and chords of Arab music and surreal visions that posit Sansour herself as the first Palestinian into space. Parodying Neil Armstrong's iconic moon landing, Sansour plants the Palestinian flag, her buoyant dance stretching across the lunar surface. She says, "That's one small step for a Palestinian, one giant leap for mankind." Her invocation of Exodus, of course, echoes both the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians from their land in 1948, as well as the Israeli perspective of history and the creation of their own mythology that influenced Western understanding, tragically, of the Palestinian reality, and the biblical Exodus and the use of that by the state of Israel to reiterate mythologies such as a land with a people for a people without a land. We witness here an outer planetary, if solitary, land grab that reimagines one of America's finest moments, the moon landing, as a Palestinian triumph. In this final scene of Space Exodus, Sansour, the astronauts, oh, here's her other piece that goes with this, with these little cute astronauts, part of the installation. There it is in the French version. I want to show this last image. Here. So this final scene of the Space Exodus, Sansour, the astronaut, a la Sandra Bullock in Gravity, appears off at Earth, right? Glistening, perhaps smoldering with its apocalyptic wars in the distance. And the Space Exodus, of course, likewise echoes the roots of astrofuturism in the United States. This concept refers to the aesthetic, scientific, and political movement that developed amid mid-century Cold War commitments to the space race here in the US, when outer space represented, on the one hand, speculation about colonial exploration and the presumed imperial ends of US technological and political power, and on the other, liberal and utopian ideals for solutions to the conflicts and perils of modern American life. In DeWitt Kilgore's estimation, Astrofuturists sought the amelioration of racial difference and social antagonisms through the conquest of space. The narratives of planetary exile that Kilgore reads have been critical to the Black freedom movements in the forms of Afrofuturism and Afro-surrealism. These stories feature African Americans and their diasporic counterparts cast out into space in search for another planet on which to produce a culture free of racism, genocidal mania, and hierarchical economic systems advanced by Eurocentrism and Western imperialism. Sounds great, doesn't it? And yet, as Ramzi Fawaz writes in his treatment of the racial and colonial context of Afrofuturist cinema, narratives of planetary exile often result in an investigation of the very world or worlds that one intends to escape, sometimes even more so than the supposedly utopian place of exile itself. So Sansour's A Space Exodus not only conjures the echoes of Afro and Astrofuturist political and aesthetic traditions, but it also makes available a critique of the present-day securitization of aerospace. This piece calls attention to the contemporary logics of war and terror, in which aerospace represents the final frontier for both US and Israeli global counterinsurgency operations and the so-called full-spectrum dominance of the 21st century. For example, historian Alfred McCoy has noted how the Obama administration presided over a technological revolution in defense planning, moving the nation far beyond bayonets and battleships to cyber warfare and the full-scale weaponization of space. You know that the Trump administration is imagining a sixth department for space warfare. So McCoy warns that the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan have served as the catalyst for a new information regime, fusing aerospace, cyberspace, biometrics, and robotics into an apparatus of potentially unprecedented power. US security experts hope that the integration of aerospace weaponry will evolve into a robotic command structure that will be capable of coordinating operations across all combat domains: space, cyberspace, sky, sea, and land. So the advancement of military technologies and the constitutive illusion of techno-mastery, ostensibly central to future US global dominion, begs the ultimate question: what do US counterinsurgency operations in outer space have to do with Palestine, Israel, and the global security state apparatuses that structure the colonial presence? So when analyzing the outer planetary ambition of US forever wars, it's crucial to underline the transnational connections between the US and Israel as joint settler security states, whose sovereign claims to territorial jurisdiction have drawn on shared covenantal narratives that underwrite the permanent dispossession of native peoples. These insights call attention to the strategic collaborations between military and defense planners in the US and Israel, and trace what Laleh Khalili has called the horizontal circuits of securitization that broadly characterize the post-Cold War era. Beginning in the late 80s under the drug wars and then after 9/11, there was a massive restructuring of domestic and foreign police forces under the rubric of Homeland Security, which paved the way for a transnational network of policing and military strategies across uneven occupied areas, including urban Black communities in the US and occupied Palestine. So as many scholars have recently argued, Palestine is the so-called archetypal laboratory for the development and articulation of these new technologies of security and late modern war making, then perhaps outer space can serve as the template and testing ground not only for US and Israeli global counterinsurgencies, but also for utopian imaginings beyond the here and now of cybersecurity violence. My point is that it's not only experts that they are the only ones who share information. Instead, we benefit from turning to the transnational and diasporic networks of knowledge and affiliation produced by these radical diasporic culture producers, Afrofuturists and Arab futurists alike, precisely for the alternative logics of security and freedom that they manifest in their works. So in that spirit, and by way of conclusion, I know I'm talking, it feels like forever, I want to revisit the final scene that I mentioned here, and premise of Sansour's lunar setting in A Space Exodus. So what I think is particularly queerly beautiful about Sansour's futurist vision of Palestine is that it neither elides the realities of Israeli occupation nor capitulates to a sense of its inevitability. The political messiness and contaminated status of the artist's visionary aesthetics aligns neatly with the strand of decolonial queer studies that I've invoked in this talk. After triumphantly planting the Palestinian flag, Larissa the astronaut appears to lose radio connection with Jerusalem, the homeland. She calls out, "Jerusalem? Jerusalem?" Kind of like Houston. But there's only radio silence from the other side. Some critics have read this final scene as an allegory for the Palestinian people's tragic nightmare, a depressive sign of the hollowness of their deterritorialization and the loss of their continuous temporality. In her review of the piece, Palestinian-American critic Ronak Kapadia, for example, laments, quote, "Even if we follow our dreams to the edge of the universe, even if we plant our flag on new territory, we will still feel defeated, we will still be lost if there's no communication, no response, no connection to Jerusalem." I want to suggest another clear reading of what happens when we follow Sansour's move through the Earth's upper atmosphere to outer space and linger otherwise in the lunar zone. What might it mean to be lost in space? Untethered, exiled, cast out beyond the horizon, unbounded, far from home. If this represents the unshakable dystopian here and now of the Palestinian diasporic people under the constraints of Zionist framings, how might we reimagine a then and there of Arab futuristic queer utopian possibility in the terms of the late great Jose Esteban Munoz? Munoz's prophetic contributions to queer utopian hermeneutics animate or haunt my interest in Sansour's dystopic fantasy vision of a future Palestine, as well as the intimacies of racialized and indigenous bodies and their inhabitants writ large. In an early essay on gesture, ephemera, and queer feeling, he reminds us that the dispossessed are, quote, appropriately adept at critiquing possession as a logic. We can understand queerness itself, he continues, as being filled with the intention to be lost. Queerness is illegible and therefore lost in relation to the straight mind's mapping of space. Queerness is lost in space or lost in relation to the space of heteronormativity. So perhaps we can identify here not only a repudiation of heteronormativity, but as I've suggested here today, the normative violence of settler colonial security states too. In this final scene of the space exodus, the antagonisms on Earth have led to a sense of permanent exile, a forever quest to search for new homes. Sansour leaves us with a structure of feeling that is not only about statelessness, but also weightlessness too. To be without gravity, untethered by the weight of the body and its inscriptions, is a queer feminist decolonial sensation. I dwell on world-making insurgent aesthetics that theorize forms of critical self-enactment and to advance new approaches to queer feminist decolonial flight, on escape, on being illegible, missing in action, perhaps even unreadable, even by the superpanoptic gaze of US and Israeli surveillance and security states as they try to reach all the way up to the heavens. So in closing, I've established this critical intimacy today with the sensuous projects of Larissa Sansour to ask after other worlds and to launch an inquiry into how other worlds matter for being in this world. If cosmic queerness is to be lost, then perhaps we don't want to be found, at least not on the security planner's map of settler colonial violence. Being lost, untethered, cast out into outer space gives us new ways of imagining the politics of verticality and atmospheric warfare, as well as a generative decolonial queer praxis of sensing and feeling vulnerable in relation to others in the world. Searching for Palestinians in the sky, where Zionist strangleholds on the present are no more, enacts what Munoz called a form of politicized cruising, identifying and animating affective and cognitive maps of the world that a critically queer utopianism can create, maps that do include utopia. By unfolding and unfolding Sansour's speculative visualities, I've sought to infuse into account of Palestine's dystopic here and now a renewed and newly animated sense of the social that can be glimpsed and felt in Arab futurist diasporic culture production. My contrapuntal queer feminist reading of these territorialist fantasies offers a form of insurgent aesthetics that critiques Israeli settler security violence while simultaneously centering diverse modes of Palestinian insurgency. An analysis of Larissa Sansour's visionary aesthetics thus allows us to move beyond the perverse calculus of settler colonial violence to propose urgently needed alternatives to US and Israeli forever wars, while also asking after Palestine's queer life worlds, past, present, future, and in the sky. Thank you.
Let's have a conversation.
You're still here. So let's start with that.
Questions, comments, elaborations. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll start with pre-critical reflections too. I feel like we need to have a full shaped question. All this is
I was struck by the fact that these utopias have no economy. And does the queer mind always need to travel into places of no economy, or is there actually food and water.
Oh, well, what do you mean by no comment? Because there's, of course, that image of her with those salad bowls.
Yeah, but it looks spoiled. It looks like it's not right.
Right.
And
yeah.
and it looks unsustainable.
Yes, absolutely.
And like the big towers often actually are.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think it's interesting that she's gesturing at that kind of contaminated nature, right? So that even the future imagining is still tinged with the realities of unsustainability in the here now that we're, of course, all experiencing here in California. You certainly are experiencing as well. And so I think part of what interests me in this form of what I'm calling concrete utopia, block, is that it is always tethered to a materialist critique of the here and now, right? So the visions of future worlds are not, they're not untethered from the problems, including the political economies of the present moment. Or the recognition that Gaza is unsustainable by 2020, right? Which is, of course, on her mind and in her map as well. So those things are twined simultaneously. And one of the questions that this brings up in the broader spectrum of speculative visualities or speculative fiction work is, why are they always alone? Why are there always this solitary femme figure in the desert, right? Trying to do terraformation work somewhere in some no space. And here again, I think there are a couple of images where you see that she's pregnant in the film, that she was pregnant at the time when she shot the film, and so she's like caressing her belly at some times, and you get the sense of a kind of a reproductive futurity that exists in space. What would that mean? But then nobody else really around except for those couple people side-eyeing her when she first arrived, who of course productively walk away. So something about the solitariness here concerns me, given my general political orientation towards collaboration, collectivity, and what I'm calling in my book sensuous affiliations that are quite crucial for moving past the here and now. And so why is it that there's this recourse to the solitary, something I'm still mapping and thinking about and hoping that we can disrupt.
Thank you very much. So going back to the nation state, you started with those images of the haunting posters from the 30s, right? On Visit Palestine, Visit
Sure.
It's like there's an immediately recognizable visual representation of the impossible utopias, but then there's also also immediately recognizable image of destruction, right? Like the tower. The first image that came to my mind is the Tower of Babel, right? It's you're trying to reach a utopia that's clearly will not work, but then it's also, the whole idea of the project is going to be just completely shattered in a way. So, for me, I guess what I was struggling with the most is, from one angle, yes, it can be read as, right, we're being, what do we do with being lost? But then also, what do we do when we're completely destroyed, right? Or when something is just brought to the ground? There's also something there about mourning, right? Not only. That's.
Yeah, that's part of what I was talking about, the idea of skyscrapers as cemeteries, right? Because the skyscraper is affecting air and spectrum and land and territory, and displacing the world that were there before, and what could be imagined after the skyscraper is no more, right? And so she's attentive to all those dynamics, right? She's attentive to the way that really the project is, and the nation state, this project was up for a big prize in Italy. I can't remember the name of the prize, the Hugo Boss Prize or something. And at some point, the way I found out about her work actually is that she was banned she was going to win the award, and they pulled it from her. And it caused this whole stir, and of course there's a whole part of, the question about Palestinian censorship and the artists from Palestine and its diaspora that they thought the work was too political, of course, right? And then, of course, it opened up all the other life worlds for her to circulate her project, and now she's representing Copenhagen in the Venice Biennial this year. And so her status is certainly extended in interesting ways. But it's just interesting to think that why does this irk people so much? This is cheeky. This is clearly humor. Her larger oeuvre, visual oeuvre, is kind of has a comedy western themes to it to some degree. So she's drawing on those traditions in some sense here. These kind of pop cultural images. But it's disturbing people in certain kinds of ways, as we can imagine. I think part of it is because it calls attention to the here and now, right? Of the impossibility, not only of future imaginings of Palestine, whatever that will entail, which is a conversation for Palestinian peoples to be having, right? And to be leading and be the visionary people behind. But then also the impossibility of the here and now that exists today, right? And then why are we comfortable with that?
So I think that's part of what she's doing with her art, is not to imagine some prescriptive no place. Right? Again, the form of utopia is something that is very saturated with the present world, which is continuing to show Palestine, how that's conjured for us. It's always through these kind of pornotropic imaginings of violence, suffering, death, decay, detritus, and even like the romantic images of the man throwing the rock from that last year, which looks like this Baroque Renaissance painting, right? You know, those are the images of Palestinian resistance that we're starting to see, where they're very gritty, right? And here, I think there's something grim but not gritty, right? And it's instead completely anesthetized, right? It's completely evacuated of that flavor, of that grit, and it's a very sterile environment, like a hospital waiting room, really, in some sense. But then, ironically, as I mentioned, the Gulfy obsession with skyscrapers, there's also, you know, like the new Arab world and a kind of imaginings of what luxury means and what finance capital looks like in the Arab region. She's also playing off of that, of course. And part of the idea of Gulfy futurism is the idea of a whole generation of people who grew up in shopping malls, basically, throughout the Gulf region, and what kinds of futures they imagine or don't imagine. So she's playing off of all those things, but I think part of why I was drawn to her work and why I spent a whole chapter in the book sort of focusing on her is because it seems so in contrast to the kind of monumental, heroic, gritty forms of documentary realism. In fact, her sister is a documentary filmmaker who's making a film about Bethlehem, their city, and it's called it's part of this NGO project called Open Bethlehem. So she's playing against the expected aesthetic forms in which we're used to receiving, and I think the humor dimension is part of that, because it's you're not supposed to make light of the situation, and how to do that in a way that's delicate and thoughtful and engage with people, because there are plenty of folks who think that this is stylized and aesthetically interesting, but not at all tethered to the reality of what Palestinian artists, for example, are dealing with in the occupied territories. So there's a kind of contrast, that the flipping of the opposite. And in my project in general, I'm interested in that, right? Like, so if the security state is doing certain things with verticality, what are other ways to queer the idea of verticality, right? If the security state is involving drones and this view from above, then what are other views from above that take a more decolonial direction? And so I'm always trying to mimic the form that the security state takes, and in fact, she's doing that work too, right? She's very much engaged. And what I didn't mention is the third project in the trilogy. Sorry, I'm blabbing here. But the third project is called In the Future, They Ate from the Finest of Porcelain, in this piece. And what she's done is she's imagined in the year 3000, a mythic future Palestinian society that is digging up the remnants of a past Palestinian society, and the porcelain, even the salad, the bowls that she's eating out of. So they're like, and she literally went and did a dig and filmed this dig, and there are these archaeologists who are being brought together to talk about this mythic society that existed back in the day. And of course, it's a cheeky conjuring of the Israeli obsession with archaeology and digs in order to develop some claim on the land, right? So she's a theorist. She is a theorist of Israeli state violence and its machinations, and is manifesting that in her projects in these unlikely and interesting ways.
Well, maybe the most startling thing to me that you said was at the very end, when you said that these look dark, and but that you see a visionary, utopian possibility there. I can see that, and so you kind of opened my eyes to that. I can see it more in the Space Exodus, but not so much in the Nation State, which seems to me like satirical, dark. If it's a utopia like that, it's like the Israeli utopia, something Jared Kushner might create as a peace plan,
Yeah, and put Trump Tower on the
but so I just barely can glimpse your proposal at the end in the Space Odyssey, but not so much in the other one. Even though the other one you showed us these powerful images that we won't forget, and they're potent.
Interesting that I'm moving in reverse chronological order the way that I talked about it. Right? So her earlier work was Space Exodus. Those were in the Palestinians, those little guys. This is 2008, and then Nation of States 2012, 2013, and then the Israeli dig stuff is is 2016. So you can tell even in her trilogy that her own research paradigms have produced a kind of darker or dystopic dimension to this. But I want to push on the idea that visionary or the visionary fiction or the utopian must always be a space of emancipatory happy place. And I think this is a qualitative shift in thinking about what constitutes the utopian. Because part of what I'm saying is that the utopian is always embedded in historically situated struggles. It's always in this dialectical relation, oppose and propose, right? It's like, there's always this kind of struggle stuff. It's not some happy space where everything is groovy and great. And so in some sense, I see her working that out, whereas here it's like, let's just bounce, let's peace out to the moon, right? And a kind of what I call critical escapology as one aesthetic strategy, which, there's a whole feminist performance art tradition and visual art tradition about this kind of work, right? About escape. But instead, then she says, okay, well, let's not think about escape, let's think about other dimensions of verticality where, no, actually we are enclosed. This is a politics of enclosure that moves us forward in a certain kind of way. So all the question about speed and mobility, the fact that Palestinians who have to endure checkpoints and can't get from one region to another suddenly can use an elevator, press the elevator, and get to other areas, right? So that's a huge advancement, right? And then they can get in and out instead of having to go through Jordan. There's all this stuff that she talks about in the literature related to the film. So there's advancements in those dimensions. But then you see that when she actually starts to become more prescriptive of what that future imagining will look like, then I've teased out for you all the terrors, right, and all the isolation and the feelings of scarcity and excess and waste. So isn't that such a great metaphor for like the discussion around Palestine post-return and discussions around nationhood? And I mean, in the longer chapter, which is not right at the top of my head, I talk about how this project was created around what is the UN resolution in 2012 that was trying to get recognition for a Palestinian state, and it was denied over and over again. Right? So this project was created in the context of UN recognition for statehood, and part of what I talk about in the chapter is like, is statehood the goal here? Is recognition for nationhood the end game? It is for certain groups of Palestinian peoples, right? But other people who are saying, actually, no, we need to displace the very idea of the nation form. And so I think she's partly dealing with that, right? It's having a conversation about that is already happening in the activist and legal tradition as well, but through the aesthetic. Does that make sense to you? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, there's a way also that the nation's estate piece in particular is kind of connecting that critical engagement with the nation-state project writ large as like the overarching political horizon to the kind of the material conditions of late capitalism and neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Right? That's what's so kind of vacuous about this space, what's empty, about what's sort of antisocial about the nation state.
Yeah.
And so the Gulf equality kind of captures a bit of that.
Sure.
And also the ways in which the kind of what you were describing as the kind of monumental images of Palestinian liberation and freedom are really kind of troubled here in cheeky and humorous and in critical ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? That also are not they're not playing on the images of suffering and loss and sort of embodied forms of resistance that so many in the West are sort of thinking about routinely.
Which is why I talk about it as a kind of queer feminist aesthetic practice, because it is attending not to the monumental and the major, but really writing those minor reports and certain
I want to ask something about release of aesthetics.
Okay.
Just this, and we can take a couple of steps to get there. So thinking of aesthetics as a form of bodily classification, in the sense of aesthetics being good taste, therefore good identification. and therefore classifying bodies according to one's tastes. And I think that the high-rise in science fiction films,
Okay.
where it's the high-rise is the space of freedom, it's capitalist freedom, because it gives one choices. But the choices available to the people who live in the high-rises are out in the hinterlands. Drugs, sex, think of Blade Runner.
Okay.
Where do you go for your pleasures and your vices?
Sure.
You go to Chinatown. Same in Star Wars, etc. And so the high-rise as the place of total surveillance, the bodies are completely under control. And their escape is to the site of the underpass, the natives. And it's curious how this is reversed in the view which you have behind you now, where Jerusalem is the ghetto. And in science fiction film, that would be a sign of the other bodies which are available to the so that's.
Why didn't you say that to me 9 months ago? That's a great line that I would definitely insert in, because it
But I
speaks.
was also thinking of Isaac Julian's last film, and I'm blanking out his name.
Not true.
The one filmed in the Gulf. And it's follows the narrative about a banker who's a Filipino maid. And so that's where we see she's under medical labor who performs in these sites and raise initial questions like we don't have any sense of who's doing labor. And Isaac Julian's film is
Playtime.
Playtime. Yes. An absolute focus on aesthetics as control. Everything is under his control in terms of aesthetics of film.
I wonder how you put that in relationship to the space exodus, which is all about loss of control, right? Loss of connection, loss of communication. I mean, that's why I end there, because I think it's more open and kind of supple in terms of talking about unfolding this kind of speculative nature, right? Because it's like, oh, she is untethered, she has lost control, but that in that loss of control, that there is something, there's a virtue there perhaps, there's something there as a kind of, not a mode of resistance, but a mode of exchange. So I'm thinking, my project, aesthetics, not only about truth and beauty, value, but as a mode of exchange, right, between artists, between the community of artists that I pull together in this way. So that's part of how I'm thinking about insurgent aesthetic. The idea of insurgency, the root of insurgent from Latin is the 17th century, insurgere, to rise. So to rise up, rebellion, etc. So then all the kind of vertical dimensions of the project are about capturing the ideas of forms of flight that are unexpected and that we expect to think of as failures. Because that moment, Jerusalem's supposed to be read as a failure, right? Even in that moment when she's got it all the way there, and the fact she doesn't have that connection to Jerusalem. And what I'm saying is, actually, what we read as failure can be mined as this otherwise possible to elucidate. Thank you. That's good. I'm gonna have to look up that
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. And I want to ask about queerness in your project. And unfortunately, I haven't started the book yet, but it is in my cart right now. And I guess I'm thinking about this project. You've used the word queering to describe this project, and I just wanted to hear you elaborate on that more. Maybe it pertains to other projects you look at in the book, sort of more closely, but if you could talk about it with regards to this.
Yeah, so part of what I'm saying here is that we need a queer feminist decolonial method or analytic to look at questions of race, war, and empire. And so the book is not about LGBTQ populations at all. It's an anti-identitarian frame to think about affects, affiliations, and logic. So I use queerness to talk about both the expert sciences and logics of the dominant security state, and then the alternative logics, alternative queer logics that have been produced produced by this cohort of artists that I'm tracking and paying attention to. Then the idea of affects. So of course queer studies and feminist studies in particular, that consortium is so crucial for thinking about affect, sensation, embodiment. It is the place to go to that work. And so one of the arguments is that that studies of race, war, and empire are impoverished without developing and extending attention to kind of queer and feminist methods in relations to the archive and so forth. And then the last way to think about affiliations, queerness as a mode of affiliation. So in the project, I'm trying to theorize Arab Muslim salvation, which is this loose, and I put it in quotes, and it meant something different in 2003 when and in the aftermath of 9/11, when a group of activists, primarily in North America, were trying to think about detention, deportation, and long histories of police brutality and police violence to the new global war on terror. And so that constellation of Arab Muslim salvation meant something quite distinct in that period that it no longer obtains in 2019. And one of the thoughts in the introduction of the book is like how to reconcile the seemingly durative nature of forever war making, forever, the perpetuity of that, with this seemingly ephemeral constellation that emerged in a specific time and place, specifically New York in the early 2000s, that did a certain kind of work, right? And so that's, that I didn't think about it at the time, but the book was conceived in the Bush II era, written and researched during Obama, and finished, with Trump, and the epilogue is all about the Trump baby balloon protests in the UK, and other forms of visual insurgency, and the woman, Patricia Como, who scaled the Statue of Liberty on the 4th of July. And so it's all these, and if I had more time, I would do that version of the talk, connecting to this, because again, it's these forms of feminist fugitivities in the sky, right? Literally, she's on the Statue of Liberty saying, I'm not going to come down until the world changes, right? Until the world is transformed. Because she's, of course, protesting the child separation policy of the Trump administration on the U.S.-Mexico border. And so part of what I'm trying to do is say, okay, I'm not a historian, but I am tracking these different permutations of the long war, the forever war, over this period of time. And Arab Muslim salvation is a queer, I'm trying to develop it as a kind of queer poetics of relationality, to say that there is a kind of loose, it's not an identitarian formation, but there's this loose forms of fellow feeling that emerge in a particular time and place because of the forms of violences that the forever war produced, right? And the forever war is changing and permutating and bringing new populations and creating new cleavages and disaggregations. And so the need for that could not be more urgent, right? For those kinds of queer forms of fellow feeling. So that's the way that I'm approaching queer studies, and there's lots of discussion in the EndNote about that usage of queerness, right, as an analytic, as opposed to the work in queer studies about decolonizing erotics. It's not like the erotic project at the heart of queer studies is not central to what I'm doing, but it is. It's just not the focus.
I have so much more to say, but I also was curious about other folks. Bye, everyone. Can I ask you one other thing? Connecting that last comment about queerness and kind of thinking about Arab Muslim salvation sort of against an identitarian project. And one of the things that your work does so clearly here is remind us of the necessity of reading Race, War, and Empire kind of against the grain of the sociological and the empirical, and the sort of the political science literature, political economy, the sort of the area studies haunted around so much of that study. And I'm wondering if you could sort of suss that out a little bit more as like a contribution that you're making to raising.
Yeah, I mean, there's and I think your work, of course, is very central to that framing too, about culture as a site of contestation and struggle, and that we can't evacuate the space about critical works and scholarly works around race, war, and empire, war on terror, policing, security regimes, and so forth, are so closely attuned to the dominant way of thinking that they almost make it seem monolithic or omniscient, or that it's forever, and that we need to go somewhere else. We need a politics of refreshment, right? We need another aperture, and that the space of queer feminist cultural practice is offering us that, right? It replenishes our imaginations because our imaginations have been so impoverished by the prevailing ways of thinking about war, terrorism, political violence, and so forth. And so we keep having the same kinds of conversations over and over again, and some people are really into that, right? And so displacing the fetish and saying, let's go to this other place that we wouldn't imagine as being part of that conversation. And so, in the introduction, I thread this needle where I say, here are the people who are doing interesting work for my project around security state, around bringing neoliberal racial regimes together, thinking about the long 20th century and the uninterrupted history of U.S. war making in the Asias, which then produced wartime migrations to the U.S. I do all that work. But then I also come down and say, well, what is the role of contemporary art and aesthetics in that conversation? And there's such an efflorescence of work in Arab, Muslim, South Asian diaspora studies, but very little attention to contemporary art and its purchase as a critical space of study. So aesthetics is a critical space of study that can tell us these things, big questions around counterinsurgency and policing and so forth, and bodies as well, right? So that's part of it, and also as a recognition that these group of artists that I'm looking at have all become huge in their own right over the space of the last 10 to 15 years in the contemporary art world, and their work circulates in different interesting ways. For example, Larissa has never had a solo show in the United States. Well, why might that be? Right? Why is she great, all over Europe and the Middle East? Why do certain artists travel in Europe or the Middle East at Sharjah and those biennials and not in the United States? That's not my project, but just being attentive to those global art world dimensions is important because these figures have really never been written about in performance studies or visual studies or critical ethnic studies, right? And I'm an Americanist, so that's my project, is to look at the work of diasporic artists in the US and Europe, not artists in what we imagine to be the terrain of war making in the Greater Middle East. But the Greater Middle East is an area study center, so I can't escape it. Even my frames are embedded in area ways of knowing, but it's a recognition that we can't completely dump area studies, but we can definitely disturb it, disentangle it, and challenge it by attending to art and saying art is a primary object that you need to think through security studies, or the surveillance studies and so forth.
It's like a follow-up to this, but also I was thinking of the question that I made and about humor in relation to this, because I remember that, but I never thought about humor in that way. So and it relates to group aesthetics, for example, where when I was thinking of why was this funny to me, right? I mean, humor particularly is something that works in a situation when it talks to group politics. Humor is something so cultural.
And
right?
inside, you have to know the codes.
First, exactly, right? So you are talking to the group and you are hoping to be funny to somebody else, right? So it's very situated and dated type of aesthetics, right?
Interesting.
So it is also a very exclusionary thing.
Okay.
So when I'm thinking of how we're circulating or how they are taking, right? If you choose humor, satirical, as your main aesthetics, right? And you're making a very sort of strong political claim about audience. And so I see this playing in these words, right? And then that may have circulation or not, but it is also very bold. And it requires participation, right? So I think that is in the politics clause as well.
Well, the question of audience is important because she, of course, is a London-based artist who was in Copenhagen for many years. She still has claims in Bethlehem, or as I mentioned, her sister is a documentary filmmaker in Bethlehem. But how to open up a diasporic conversation around this question is part of what we're getting at, right? What does it mean when Arab diasporic artists are making these kinds of gestural interventions, and how does that get read by people in Palestine and its diaspora? It's read differently in different places. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in my project is say, part of the insurgency of this group of artists is their actual geographic estrangement from the spaces that they come from, their homelands, the places that are being bombed and ravished. And that estrangement produces a sense. One of the ways they manage or reconcile that estrangement, there's a lot of diaspora thinking and talking with them, is through a kind of mode of insurgency that then is also, in my purpose, links Arab, Muslim, South Asian of the 21st century to the long history of Black and Native-led rebellion, to counterinsurgency projects in the New World, right? Which is not how Larissa necessarily sees it, but that's how I'm trying to locate what this group of artists is doing. Say, this is a constellation of artists who are part of a much longer conversation in the New World, in North America, right, around, because counterinsurgencies are as old as empire, they're 1492 to the present, right? And so what does it mean to put these very contemporary people into that longer historical tradition? You can only do that if you read diaspora studies and you're engaged in kind of transnational diasporic conversations, which often US-based conversations critical offense studies tends to discount. So do you see the thing that I'm wedged here? So I appreciate that it's the question of audience is legible to you because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.